Prospect House Media.
And now, prepare yourself for the only weekly podcast you won't want to miss. Welcome to the Ameritocracy Show with Troy Edgar, live from our studios in Los Angeles and Washington, D.C.
Hey everybody, I am Troy Edgar and welcome to the Ameritocracy Show. Thank you for tuning in and checking it out. It is greatly appreciated. This podcast examines the conditions for personal and economic growth and opportunity across America. This week, Washington D.C. lobbyist Ryan Leavitt sits down with me at the Prospect House to talk about finding his focus early and his path to Washington, D.C. We also discuss what it means to be self-made or just best prepared to take advantage of the breaks and the opportunities along the way. Lastly, we discuss federal funding in the context of the president's recently released budget and the roles of the White House, Congress, and lobbyists in that process. Ryan Leavitt has been very successful. He was born and raised in Southern Nevada, and as a young student, he took his first school trip to Washington, D.C. and returned home and told his parents, "This is where I want to be." Ryan earned his bachelor's degree in political science from BYU and his Juris Doctorate in law from George Mason University at the Antonin Scalia Law School. He is a member of the bar for both the District of Columbia and the U.S. Supreme Court. I met Ryan in 2019 when he was a senior congressional staff member in the U.S. Senate. He had helped guide me through my Senate confirmation for the Department of Homeland Security. He is a very humble and a thoughtful person, and we quickly formed a friendship. We stay in touch and enjoy breaking bread with friends at the Palm Restaurant whenever we get a chance. I hope you enjoy. Hello, Ryan. Thanks for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Troy. Really excited to join you today.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to talk with you and to have you here coming to the Prospect House here in Washington, D.C. You and I have known each other since about 2019, but our relationships kind of extend along past that, mutual friends. You are currently a lobbyist, and I met you when you were actually in the U.S. Senate working in Capitol Hill with senators out there. And you're very instrumental in helping me guide through the presidential appointment process when I was nominated, and it eventually led to successful confirmation. So I thought it would be great to have you on to be able to talk a little bit about your journey from where you came from, coming to Capitol Hill, moving on to be a lobbyist, and then and obviously a beautiful family. So you really have been able to kind of go through and put all the pieces of what you would define as the meaning of life in place and execute. And I've told you this before, outside over dinners at the Palm, is you don't leave anything on the table. You've almost, I think you're worse than me. It's like, I try to make sure I maximize every single opportunity for things because I value my time with my family. I value my time at work. I value my friendships. I value my faith. So going through that, but it would be helpful for the listeners if you'd kind of step back a little bit and just talk about your journey here and where you started.
Well, I'd love to do that. And again, Troy, thanks so much for having me on this program. As you mentioned, I am a lobbyist, which is kind of a dirty word. For people outside of the Beltway, they say, "Oh, a lobbyist, that's where all the swamp creatures are." And unfortunately, I think my profession gets a bad rap, and we can talk more about that as we go through the program, but a little bit of background on my journey. I grew up in Southern Nevada. I grew up in a suburb of Las Vegas. The youngest of 4 children. All of my siblings stayed there. I'm the only one in my family that moved away. I grew up in sort of a normal suburban middle-class family. I went to public schools. And when I was a young kid, probably 12, 13 years old, my family took the trip to Washington, D.C. that everybody tries to take when you have, a family. And I fell in love with D.C. I told my parents I want to come back here when I'm older. I felt connected to the city. I didn't know when I would come and how that would work out, but I knew I loved it here. I graduated high school. I was really active in student government. I was the student body president, and I joined the State Student Council Association. I was the president of that for the state of Nevada. When I was 15 years old, I was elected as the student member of the Nevada State Board of Education, and every 6 weeks I'd fly on an airplane by myself to the state capitol in Carson City, and I would spend the weekend with the State Board of Education. I had an unusual high school experience that way, and I always felt drawn to public policy and politics. And after I graduated high school, I did a 2-year religious mission for my church in Eastern Europe. So I lived in Armenia and the Republic of Georgia for 2 years, which was a wonderful experience for me, shaped my perspective on a lot of things. First of all, I was 19 years old, and I lived 12 time zones away from my parents. For 2 years. I could call them twice a year on Christmas and Mother's Day. But it was a good experience. I grew up, and then I came back. I went to college, and I did internships. So I wanted to come back to D.C., so I signed up for internships through my school, and I got a lot of rejections. I was not a well-connected political person. I didn't come from a political family, didn't come from wealth and all of that. And so I was just sort of putting my resume out there, hoping to get something. And ultimately, I was able to get an internship on Capitol Hill. And I knew that at that point that this is a career path I wanted to try to get back on. And so I went, after my internship that summer here in DC, I went back and finished school, and then came back to DC just a few days after graduating college. I was offered a job. And I spent the next almost 10 years on Capitol Hill. And I also went to law school at night. So I wanted to get a law degree. I always wanted to do that. And so I ended up, while being a full-time congressional staffer, I did nighttime law school to do it all at the same time.
Yeah, that's a pretty incredible story, is that when I got out of the Navy trying to get my degree, when you're doing that, trying to do a great job at work and do especially a law degree would be interesting, how you were able to manage all of those things, and whether you can do it at its top level. It's interesting that I think that people, when they get into that type of an arrangement, you really start to parse out like what's most important. And where do I spend my time? And it's a Navy term, but a lot of people, even in my profession, they focus on polishing the cannonball versus just shooting it. And it's like, look, you can't shine that thing up anymore. It's got to be shot. When you're in a time crunch, you don't make the papers exactly perfect. When you're in school, you get to the point, and you got to just kind of go. And I found, I don't know how that was for you.
I always find that I do better with time management when I'm busy. I have a lot of wiggle room, I find myself wasting time. But when you have a lot going on, and this is very much in my profession now, I have to be a master at time management organization, because if not, you're going to be in a world of hurt. And there just wasn't a lot of time to waste, and there still isn't. So
when you get to DC 2011, you start your journey on Capitol Hill. It's interesting. Watching, when you go there, I've been there when I was a mayor of a city, came out here, did a lot of lobbying for water and sewer districts. And you come across a lot of different staff that work on Capitol Hill, on the Senate and the Congress and the House side. But some people, are very young and they just got there. Some are different levels. And I was just kind of curious, when you got here and you started to gain responsibility and eminence in your areas and legislation, when you read your resume today of like your assignments back in when you first started, and then you kind of see where you're at as a lobbyist. Can you talk about that first day, that first month, that first year? Do the policies and the processes pick you? Do you have a path? If somebody was coming to DC or their kids are coming to work here, what would you recommend, and how did that work for you?
So Capitol Hill, there's a broad spectrum of experience. And the most common way to get on Capitol Hill is do it the way I did it. You do an internship, and then you just work your way up. Now, there are some policy experts that will join congressional committees because of their expertise later in their careers. That's more unusual. I would say the vast majority of congressional staffers intern either while they're in college or fresh out of college. And my experience was that it's not very glamorous, the work that you do at first. You answer the phone, you sort the mail, you take people on congressional staff-led tours of the U.S. Capitol building. You are sort of the customer service for the office. You sit at the front desk, you greet people, and it can, for me, I was impatient. I wanted to do more. I wanted to be involved in the policy-making process, and I was going to law school at the time. And so as I progressed in my legal education, I was also able to congruently get more responsibility in the office. But I always tell young staffers, just focus on whatever they need you to be doing and do it with a good attitude. You may be unhappy having to talk to angry constituents on the phone, but somebody needs to do that. It's an important work. And you sort of do that, you earn your stripes, and then you prove yourself to be a good person to work with and have a good attitude. And when an opening comes up, they'll promote you. And I just continued to get promoted over the years until I was able to be a sort of a junior policy advisor and then a full senior policy advisor. I had my own sort of issue areas. I worked on the committee. And that's when I was able to really dig in deeply in the policymaking process. But it took several years of doing the junior level work in order to be given the opportunity to do that. And I think it's important for people to be patient, to know you need to earn your stripes, you need to prove yourself, and you need to learn the way the building works and the way the process works so that you can be trusted with managing a portfolio of legislative issues.
So when you were, just to kind of summarize a little bit, when you were actually starting and then kind of where you ended up now as a lobbyist, is, if you look through your background, you served on judicial committees, you were very active in that type of stuff. And, even my knowledge, when I got to know you and what your firm focuses on, or at least within your portfolio of the firm, is, you focus on infrastructure, water, appropriations, and federal funding as a big parts. Did you, when you were in there, did you just kind of rule out judicial stuff, or do you, as your portfolio started going, you started thinking, I've really got a perspective, or I've been able to make some key contacts? What pulls you into those very complex areas that really have a consumer effect to cities and counties? Previous mayor, you're talking my language when you start getting into those topics. And judicial, it's like something that happens on TV, right?
Yeah. So I would say when I was a congressional staffer working on the Judiciary Committee, and then later as a legislative director managing a whole team of policy people in the Senate, I assumed that eventually I would become a lobbyist. This is, when I went to law school, my intention was to become an attorney, a practicing lawyer at a law firm doing litigation or whatever avenue in what I would do at the firm. But as I leaned into Capitol Hill and started ticking more and more years off there, I realized that the chances of me going to do a traditional legal career were diminished, and that I was really likely to go into the government affairs consulting type of work after I finished my time on the Hill. This is a natural progression for congressional staff, that once they've put in their time on the Hill and they've gotten good experience, then it starts to become attractive to go on into the private sector. And really, there's three avenues after the Hill that you can pursue, sort of in the government affairs or lobbying space. You can go in-house at a corporation, a company, and those teams are relatively small. You can go work for a trade association, and they have a little bit larger team, typically, that work for the trade association, or you can go and become a consultant to both corporations, trade associations, cities, multi-client consulting. As a congressional staffer, I felt like I was a bureaucrat. I was used to getting my paycheck on time every couple of weeks. I'm very risk averse. I didn't view myself as an entrepreneur in the way that I wanted to go eat what I kill, so to speak.
Yep.
And so my thought was, I'll go work in-house for a corporation. I'll go get a corporate job. It felt stable. And so when I was approached to join the firm that I'm at now, where we were doing sort of the multi-client entrepreneurial work, we're going to get business, and that really helped me land in the space that I'm doing now, consulting on infrastructure and federal funding. When I first left the Hill, I thought, I'm going to go get some of these clients that are heavy on the Judiciary Committee stuff. So I thought telecom companies or technology companies or people here in D.C. that have business before the Judiciary Committee. And ultimately, I found quickly that with everything that was going on in terms of the bipartisan infrastructure bill and Congress opening up the congressionally directed spending avenue again, that a lot of the business opportunities were not here in DC, but they were out across the country in subdivisions of state and local government who are, for the first time in a decade, looking for federal help to get federal funding for their projects in their states and their cities. So that's a big part of the business that we do now. We don't exclusively just do federal funding for projects. We also work heavily on policy issues. I have healthcare clients, technology clients, also some private sector people, but we're very heavy focused on the public sector also and infrastructure projects. And a lot of that was driven by the work that was going on in the Congress and that continues to go on in the Congress.
Yeah, it seems like, again, just being a previous CFO for DHS, DHS kind of had two different business models. The appropriated business that we would go through to fund our programs and do priorities. But FEMA was a big part of it, and out of a $90 billion budget, $45 billion of it was FEMA and directed towards local jurisdictions that had a competitive process to go and do stuff. I'm in the consulting industry now, and I will also say that in the consulting industries, they break up their public and federal businesses into two different segments. They try to manage them together, but for the most part, and that spending that came through the pandemic was really to help cities and governments figure out or local governments on how to better be ready for the future. And, and it's sort of something I used to do at DHS that I was always concerned about is like we would get appropriation plus ups, and what would end up happening, especially with the Coast Guard, which is a very popular organization of DHS. A lot of the different components have different PR challenges, and CISA was another one. And especially CISA, where most of that money would go towards contracts to hire people to help them do stuff, but they really lack staff. And I was always concerned if that plus up didn't come and they started hiring a tremendous amount of staff, that eventually it would be a sugar high. They wouldn't be able to kind of continue to operate. So Congress feels like they're doing a hero's job, and they put those plus ups in. And the problem is some of the departments start depending on them every year, and that dependency then gets shattered, and then the policies kind of go awry. So I think what you were doing there, definitely I can see that being very helpful to kind of bring the voice of the community into the process, which is where the discretion is. You transitioned to the lobbying company during a really interesting and important time, where now local jurisdictions, again, previous mayor, you actually, if your city is acute or your county board that you're on for water, infrastructure, electricity, whatever, you really do need to start to prioritize the ability to get in line for the federal funding. And as a taxpayer, a mix. I want lower taxes, but the reality is that the money is there for right now. It's already been approved, already been voted on, and the city, county, and state's capability of trying to get the share for their citizens is now. And so, can you talk a little bit about like the way you made this transition? Was at a time when it wasn't as clear, and you were used to that every 2-week paycheck, and now you're getting into something that you very quickly were able to adapt to. But this maybe goes to a little bit to people that are in the city, that you live in a city where people, and you're wondering, why is my mayor in Washington, D.C.? To talk a little bit about the condition right now, or expand on it, because you already started to bring that.
So I always tell my clients, particularly the local government clients, that if you if the purpose is for you to just to come and meet with your congressman, you don't need to hire lobbyists to do that. You're the mayor of the city. They want to meet with you. So if that's your whole objective is we want to come to Washington, we want to walk around the hallways and see everybody, you don't need to invest money in that. But if your intention is to try to take some, as you said, these funds, historic level of funding on infrastructure across the board, broadband, water, transportation, bridges, ports, roads, whatever it is, historic level of funding has been appropriated. And the checks have been signed. The money is there. And if it's not coming to your community or you're coming to your state, it's going to go somewhere else. So it's a best practice as a mayor or a general manager of a special service district. It's a best practice for you to go and compete for those funds, because the taxpayers in your community have paid federal taxes,
Right.
and they should be entitled to getting as many of those taxes back to their community as possible. And that's the way I try to help people see it, particularly, fiscal conservative people who say, oh, we've spent too much. That may be the case, but the money has been spent. And if it's not going to go to your community, it's going to go to somebody else's community. So let's fight to bring it back to your community. And you should be looking hard at what are the needs in your community in terms of infrastructure. Maybe you have roads that need to be repaired. Maybe you have a water system that needs to be upgraded. There are federal funding opportunities for all of those things. And so what I do, the service that I provide to those communities is we sit down, we talk about what are your needs, and let's look at the programs that are available. And then let's go work with the federal agencies and your congressional delegation to give you the best opportunity to compete for that money. And there are several avenues. There are formula programs that money will go, usually funnels through the state government. You can compete for, you can apply for federal money through the federal formula programs. There are discretionary grants, and that's just what they are. They're discretionary. So what I've found is if communities work with their elected officials and their federal partners to put together the best package and to make a case to the federal agency, some of those decisions are somewhat subjective in terms of who wins those awards. And so we try to help people compete the best they can for a discretionary grant program. And then after a year of hiatus of Congress involving themselves in congressional directed spending, or as it's colloquially termed, earmarks, there is that opportunity again that Congress is actually directly appropriating money for projects like this. And so we're helping our clients look for these opportunities, pair opportunities with their needs in their community. And we've had great success in helping people do that. And I think a lot of the fact is that our federal elected officials want to help these communities.
Right.
Their success, the success of a city in their district is their success too. And they can claim that they've helped their constituents as they should. So that's a big part of what we do in terms of the federal funding side.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'll just give you a kind of a perspective from a city. So, city council member, mayor for 12 years. All this happened. So I was off on 2018. The city that I still am a resident of that city got a tremendous amount of money. And, this is just my opinion, didn't know what to do with it. And after having a capital asset and expenditure plan for just in case, to go invest stuff, I'm not sure what the considerations were, but what they ended up doing is putting together a creative plan of economic policy. And they basically took that pool of money and worked with the local chamber of commerce and said, hey, look, we got this money. We don't want to depend on it until longer term. It is money. We don't want to give it back. I know it's taxpayer money, but we should try to use it in the city. So they put together a process that basically they sent everybody a coupon for like $50 that you had to spend it in the city. And they called it LoSal Bucks, and they did that. And the program had mixed reviews. It's kind of hard. It's the messaging too. If you're not following financial stuff within the government, it's like, wow, we have so much money, we just got to give it back. And what about the seniors? What about youth programs after school? There's where that city that I'm from is one of the largest nonprofits per capita. Could we have done more? And at the end, not a lot of people understood how to do the program. And a lot of the merchants didn't understand how to take into the program. And so complexity becomes a problem. But no, I think that's interesting. One of the last areas that I'd like to talk to you a little bit about is about 2 or 3 weeks ago, the president had released the management budget or their budget to Congress and to, basically start a process. And I thought, as being a previous chief financial officer that worked on the, political side that kind of was with the White House as they release it and go out and start pitching it to Congress and where you were at back in the day. I'd like to talk a little bit about your role as a lobbyist, because maybe it'll give a little bit more understanding to maybe day to day, the sense of urgency that, these things come in cycles. March is that time when the president releases a budget and everything has to be potted by October 1. And somewhere in between, magic needs to happen and a lot of discretion. And so talk about your job in that period from your perspective.
I will say the busiest time of year for lobbyists that work on the appropriations process, that are heavy focused on federal funding accounts, is this time of year right now. And we gear up even before January in terms of helping our clients start thinking about what are their funding requests, what are their priorities, what are their federal needs. And then we want to spend the late, fall, early winter months helping them advocate to those offices that they're going to be approaching. They want them to see the projects. They want to try to tour them. We want them to socialize those so that once we come back in the spring when there's everybody under the sun coming to make their pitch, they're already very familiar with the types of requests that our clients are making. But you're right. So the appropriations process really kicks off kind of with the State of the Union address, to be honest with you. Yep. The president is able to address the Congress, talk about what his priorities are, and then he puts that pen to paper. And usually in early March, this year was March 9th, he released his proposed budget. The budget is not a binding document. The Congress has the power of the purse. The president can set out his priorities. They say, show me your priorities, tell me your priorities, show me the budget. The budget is the priorities. So the president's able to say, this is what I think we ought to do. Now the Congress can look at it and say, well, that's nice, but we're going to do something else, which they tend to do, but they look at the president's budget request as sort of a baseline. And it depends on if the president's party is in power or not. If it's not the president's party, they may sort of ignore it. If it is the president's party, I think they'll try to support the president's priorities. He's the leader of their party. Now, in my experience, the congressional offices have an opportunity to weigh in with the appropriations committees. The appropriations committees want to make sure they have the buy-in of their rank and file members, and that all those members have an opportunity to put forward their policy priorities and also the projects in their districts. And so what we saw this year is in late February, early March, all those congressional offices put out a notice to all their constituents. If you have priorities, please submit these. They provide opportunities for people to come forward and say, we want you to do this or that. And so we help our clients put all these requests in. There's forms and there's documents. You have to provide supporting material and all of that so that you can do that. And there's really two types of funding requests that we help people make. One are the programmatic requests. So you look at a program under the federal government and we either want to have a plus up like you talked about or have a particular program funded through that account. The other one is what's called in the House a community project funding request. In the Senate, they call it congressionally directed spending request. So these are earmarks.
Okay.
And those are very technical in terms of submitting them. There's a lot of information that you have to gather. It takes quite a lot of time. They also want to show that the projects that you're submitting have a lot of local public support. So you have to demonstrate that support. You have to get letters of support from the local chamber of commerce and the water district and the school district and whoever it is, the project that you're working on, so that when the member of Congress looks at the 40, 50, I talked to one Senate office, they say they got over 1,000 of these requests. Wow. This is, a big state. Yeah. So they have a lot of requests coming in. And so they can't submit all those requests. There's just not enough funding in the budget to allow for 1,000 projects for one senator. And in the House, they limit it to 15 requests. So they may get 60 to 100 requests, and they only get to pick 15. So you really have to put together a really nice presentation, a great narrative to help them understand this is a really good use of taxpayers' money. this is a really important project that's going to have a big impact for your district. And that takes time and effort and a lot of preparation to submit something like that. And then obviously the congressional calendar will move on, and the committees will accept these requests and they vet them. And then the committees will have a vote on the appropriations bill. They release that and the House and Senate will pass it. Historically, Congress does not get this done on time. You mentioned October 1st being the beginning of the fiscal year. Not in my experience, not in the last 20 years, probably, as Congress wrapped up its business by October 1st. They always tend to have to kick the can a few more months. They need a little bit more time, and they tend to do a continuing resolution, or they bring last year's numbers through until about Christmas time, right before the end of the year. And then for the most part, Congress is able to come with a year-end spending deal, which would include all these funding pieces.
Yeah, it's interesting as a budget and finance guy, that seems really sloppy. But what I learned, at the local level, the county level, and then here now federally is, as a taxpayer, I think it's okay. And the reason is that the default, if everything goes crazy and politics kick in, is the mechanism is to keep the budget kind of where it's at. The bad news being the CFO for DHS, if you got Coast Guard cutters and all these things that you need to fund or kick off, I'll say not, but everything kind of funds at its previous amount, it could cause a delay. And what you see in the federal government right now is a significant move towards modernization. And so a lot of that modernization stuff, even though the federal government paid for a ton of it at the local and state level, they really are trying to modernize themselves, and they're subject to this process. So that delayed process kind of helps a little bit, so things don't get too crazy and the spending get ramped up really quickly. If there are disagreements, they do get kind of worked in, quote, compromised, or if not, the bill, like you said, the continuing resolution. But any last thoughts on that?
Well, I think you make a great point. The way that we fund the government is very messy. But it's necessary because you have 435 members of the House and 100 members of the Senate who are all trying to influence that process in a very short amount of time. Everybody gets to be involved. Historically, now that hasn't always been the case. Sometimes you get to the end of the year and really the four corners, they call it, the leadership of each chamber sort of makes a deal and then foists that on their members, and that causes a lot of consternation with the rank and file members. But at the end of the day, I think funding the government from crisis to crisis, fiscal cliff to fiscal cliff, is not a good way of doing things. It's particularly difficult, I think, for the federal agencies. I look at the Department of Defense or the Pentagon spending. This is really important work that they're doing in terms of our national security, and I know that when they have to contingency plan for a government shutdown and putting their employees, non-essential employees on furlough, this is traumatic, and it's not good for our national security apparatus and our armed forces. So that's just one example, but it is messy because that's the way our Congress is organized. There's a lot of conflict there on purpose,
right?
And so the people's work is difficult and it's messy and there's a lot of conflict, but ultimately, over the last many years, the Congress is able to come to some sort of agreement sort of at the last hour to get it done. I think that right now, Congress is very divided. We have paper-thin majority, razor-thin majorities in both the House and the Senate. And so the ability for things to go haywire on these spending deals are very high. I've worked through a few government shutdowns now. And I don't want to have a bad omen or anything, but this is the type of environment that facilitates a government shutdown, because if one party wants to really dig their heels in about a particular policy issue, then you could get it to an impasse, which would have some sort of a government shutdown. The government's getting ready to deal with this debt ceiling issue.
Correct.
Very political, and also high stakes. And each side wants concessions in order to support this. The Republicans want to see decreased spending. They want to work on deficit reduction in order to have some buy-in to do the debt ceiling. And the president's budget, he included a decrease in spending and deficit reduction over the next 10 years. And so I think there is a feeling across both parties that we want to keep our spending in check. And the debt ceiling is just a difficult issue, I think, to share, with the general public. Well, we've got to increase our debt, and the national deficit's very high as is, and it's continuing to grow. But we will see. I hope we won't have a government shutdown in October.
Yeah.
But it's plausible that it could happen. Even a short-term shutdown until they're able to somebody blinks and then we end up getting a deal.
Yeah, the shutdowns definitely, like DHS, had a tremendous impact. The last one that was in the last administration, where Coast Guard funding is outside the National Defense Act funding, so it's actually appropriated DHS money. And so when they weren't able to get the bills approved, there was Coast Guard folks that went unpaid for a period of time. It's not like they can go and get a side job or drive Uber. I mean, they're out doing the work of the people. And so you're absolutely right.
Ultimately, in the last few shutdowns I've worked through, people get paid. It's delayed, but the federal workers do end up getting their pay for the work that they did.
Yeah.
And shutdowns actually cost the taxpayer more money.
That's
Not
right.
less, because some people say, yeah, shut the government down. Those people in Washington, they don't do anything good for us anyway, so just shut it down. We don't need it. Well, end up you doing these shutdowns. It costs the government more money to shut the government, open it back up, give everybody back pay. So it's actually a bad public policy to do.
No, I would agree. Well, Ryan, as we get ready to wrap up and take a look at your career and your successes that you've had, any thoughts that you would want to leave with people that are out there considering transitions into lobbying or potentially going to Capitol Hill? For this podcast, a lot of people are at different points in their life. So we're not focused on people necessarily where we're at or even above or below. It's just in general. But hopefully somebody would be listening to a lot of this discussion, have a good idea of what the job is, a good idea of how to kind of stay focused. And how you kind of set goals personally and prioritize. But I guess the kind of closing comments from your perspective, anything you'd like to leave with the listener?
Well, before I do that, I do want to thank you again, Troy, for giving me the opportunity to visit with you on this podcast. And I'll close by saying that I feel really grateful for the opportunity I've had to work in the Congress for such a good long time. I worked for wonderful members of Congress, people who are dedicated public servants who sacrifice a lot in order to serve. And as you know, as a former, presidential appointee, in the process you go through the Senate confirmation, you go under a lot of scrutiny. You give up a lot of your ability to be a private person, and you sort of open up the books and show everything about yourself. And the thing is, with members of Congress, it's the same thing. They're under incredible scrutiny. They have to disclose all of their assets and their investments and everything. So I'm grateful for those people that do that. And I was grateful for the opportunity to serve them as their staff. The advice I'd give to somebody who's interested in a career in government, I would say we need a lot of good people in government. And if you want to work on Capitol Hill, I think you want to come in very humble and willing to do whatever you're asked to do in terms of, it may not be glamorous. You may be going to get the coffee for a while. But it's the people that come in and that have a good attitude and are willing to just pitch in and do whatever they're asked to do, or the people that those congressional offices say, we like them, we want to invest in them, we like their attitude. And then you get more and more responsibility. And the next thing you know, you're helping to work on really important legislative issues. I would say continue to get educated. If you want to go to grad school, you should go to grad school. I think be cautious about the expense. I went to law school. I took out student loans to do that, and I'm still paying them back. So you want to be very conscientious about that. It's not like every bit of education makes sense financially, but I think ultimately getting a good education and pairing that with good work experience will provide you the most opportunities you can. I think, don't close doors unless you absolutely have to. Continue to build relationships with people. Help people when you can. When people come and say, "Can you help me?" Your knee-jerk reaction would say, "Yes, I want to help you." Because ultimately that builds a bond with that person, and then they want to help you ultimately, and then you have a real good relationship, rather than going to a cocktail party and just passing out your business card to 20 people. That's okay networking. I don't think it's great. I think the better type of networking is wherever position you're in and you're able to help out, then you build a real, genuine relationship with somebody, and then that's really better networking. And in terms of, any success I've had, I prescribe to the view that there is no such thing as a self-made person. Even though I came to Washington, I didn't have a big network of political connected people. I really didn't know anybody here. I kind of started from scratch. I caught a lot of breaks along the way. I had members of Congress and senators that, made calls for me to help me get into law school. I had people give me promotions and give me opportunities that maybe I didn't deserve quite yet in my career, but they believed in me and they believed that I could take it on, and I'm grateful they did that. So I don't believe in being a self-made person, but I do think that good things come to those people who are humble and who are driven, who are willing to put in the time and the work. And as long as you're engaged in something worthwhile and you're working hard at it, then good things will happen for you.
Ryan, that is the best last words that I've had. I really appreciate you coming today, and look forward to continuing our relationship. And I always enjoy every moment I get to be able to spend with you and your family. Thank you.
Thanks, Troy.
Thanks again for joining me today on the Ameritocracy Show. Be sure to follow me on social media and our website at troyedgar.com, where you can get more information and sign up for my weekly email. I hope you have a great week.